That. All right, and we are live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another discussion. So today we're going to be talking about how to measure dev team performance and probably productivity as well. There is apparently a distinction. I've got a couple of guests here. Some of them you've seen before, and we've got one new one. We're just going to do a little round of introductions, and then we'll get cracking. Should we start with you, VT?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is VT. By day, I'm a principal consultant at Demon. And by night, most nights, I podcast on zatechradio.co.za.
Who's next? Let's take Simon. Anti-clockwise.
I'm Simon. I've been doing software development of many different kinds for a very long time. I've done a fair amount of community organizing. I've, had many different roles within the sort of software environment. And currently I'm working on an open source project for controlling quantum computers. Very happy to be here again and excited to chat about metrics.
Tinus?
Yeah, so Tinus van Jefer. My claim to fame is that I started in hardcore engineering or electrical engineering at Eskom. And I told the panelists before this session, I made load checks significantly worse. So I decided, well, if that's not for me, then I need to go try my hand at software, because that's where my passion always lies. So I started as a dev. Tech stacks initially was .NET and JavaScript. It was kind of like as the JS frameworks boom started. So it was pure JS, and then it went to Angular JS, and now we've got all this JS 2+ and whatever it is. But the last few years I've transitioned into more of a culture management role where my focus is people. So mostly at Intellect, looking after leadership development, making sure teams are well set up, good ways of work, measuring performance and teaching people how they can effectively measure their performance. That's where most of my time goes.
Awesome. Africa?
Cool. And hi, everybody. I am the new kid on the block. My name is Afika, and I am a Scrum Master. I like to call myself Scrummy at Discovery for a number of teams. I've been doing this for a couple of years, and in a past life, did the whole change management spiel. I did a little bit of a stint in law. So a little bit of a mixed bag of tricks. And I'm just really excited for the conversation today.
Awesome. And I'm Sheena. I have had quite a long and winding path to get to where I am now. I'm currently the CTO of Umuzi, where we do a lot of things, but basically we try to reduce social inequality in Africa through digital education. So this topic is quite a hairy one. It's very contentious. There's a lot of people with very strong opinions, and there's a lot of argument about it at the moment on the interwebs. So I figured it would be a nice thing to chat about in a nice, calm way. So I'd like to kick it off just by, passing the ball to Tinus. So in the last discussion that we had, Tinus mentioned some stuff about how Intellect, or how he works to measure kind of the health of a dev team. Is that a good way to represent it? Would you like to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I spoke a bit about health check and how it came to be. So let me give some background and context first where this come from. This isn't really my brainchild or anything. It's stolen, like most good ideas. So essentially, Spotify trialed this team, and there was a book written, Tribe of Tribes, many years ago. And inside Spotify, as they were scaling rapidly, they tried to see, okay, how can they stay in touch with how the teams and individuals in the teams are doing? So they invented this thing called Health Check, which essentially has a series of categories and whatever. So we've kind of started Intellect. So I was working in a team where maybe it's relevant to this topic. So maybe I'll allude with what the team was. It was our service desk team, so support and maintenance. Project kind of finished main dev cycle. We're doing support teams. There was about 40 customers and 25 projects, and I think around 30-something tech stacks. Am I still live? Yes, I have.
It's still live.
And essentially, this team, obviously, with the constant change and the pressure, and obviously support isn't always the best place to be in, because when a customer calls you, it's not to say hello, how are you doing? So essentially, there was a big focus on, okay, how can we get these people working more effectively together? And I've tried many things. How to put one of it. So we've kind of built our own thing now around it. We introduced our own categories and subcategories, and we actually built a system now that tracks how we do that. We don't use it to measure performance or reviews, that stuff. It's more an enabler to an empowerment tool for our teams, we can call it that. So the basic premise is that they will go and have a series of categories with very, very, very vague descriptions, keeping them vague so that people use their own interpretation of what they're reading rather than being pushed down the alley of thinking. And no one can see each other's code. The category comes up, let's say, client relations or speed of release, for example, and each member would say red, amber, green. Amber means something. It means it's not green, but it's not horrendous. And typically we'll only have descriptions for red and green. So let's say you have speed of release, then red would be restart slow, cumbersome, dangerous, and causes me nightmares. And green would be releases are awesome, sweet, automated, and I don't even worry about it. It's quick and rollback is fast. That would be the two things. Now, whatever the individuals read into that, they'll vote. Eventually, then you get to the end, you look at all the categories, and for the first time, a lot of people pick up that they've got different perceptions. So I think that there it's useful, where people think they're aligned within the dev team. They think, oh no, our release is easy. Meanwhile, the guy with 20 years experience believes it's easy, and the poor junior who's only been deving for 6 months thinks this is the scariest thing he's ever done in his life. And could point out to like a coaching issue or a documentation issue or a process issue, whatever it is. Anyway, there's a bunch of categories. I think there's about 20 of them. And the value is not really in the score. So it's not about scoring red, amber, or green across an average. It's more about the discussion that takes part after. So you get a lot of consensus. So one category would be client relation, which is a difficult thing to measure. We're not asking the client to score here. We're asking the team to score their perception of how the client relation is going, right? So that would indicate to the team how we're doing. So if half the team says green and the half says red or amber, and clearly some people are seeing something, whatever. And then the value comes from the discussions. People typically have a discussion, they consolidate some notes, and these are the kind of things that would feed into a retro. So instead of saying, retros always have the danger of turning into a whinging session. Now the retro is an action session saying, okay, guys, we spoke about these things. When we have a retro, let's focus on our red and ambers. This is what actually went well. And then your retro usually has outcomes of tickets or things that the team can take on and address to go forward. So that's I think that's where the discussion went. So we don't use it for reviews or collaborations. It's mostly for the team.
That's cool. So you don't say, everybody get to green. Nothing like that.
and how it fluctuate. I think you told me previously, I mentioned, and it's true. I've never met a dev team that says quality of code is green. Never, ever, except the junior who just joined the project. They typically what these seniors are writing is absolutely amazing. But anyone who has something thinks the code can be better. So
yeah,
and I think that's the intent. You'll never push them to make that red green, but it's good to know. And sometimes someone will point out a green where the whole team says amber, and the discussion leads to, hey guys, we've reduced tech debt from here to here, and we haven't had major feature breakdowns after release for months now. Guys, it's actually in a good space, and it's not dev focused. So Afika, someone like you, always, obviously sometimes the DAs or Scrum will ask me, but how do I vote here? Because I don't know. And I told them, no, you know, because even though you don't see the code, what's your perception of it? How many bugs do you find? Is there constant issues in QA testing? And that should point to your quality of code, because it's your perception that matters. And I think it's important to look at it like that, because you said it's a contentious issue, and there's a lot of opinions out there, and I think oftentimes it's that people debate each other on a topic of what is right and what's wrong, and they all debate it from a different angle. So the developers would sometimes it seems like developers fear being reviewed or scored or whatever, because creative and complex domain or whatever. although I've never, maybe it's just in my experience, but I've never spoken to a developer and told them, hey, if you want to get better, or if you want to get to that architect level, or you want to, take on this piece of design work, you can work on these things. I've never had a developer come to me and say, no, thank you, I don't want to hear that, or I don't want to see that. Like, most developers are keen for growth and knowledge and learning better and adapting. So if you just rephrase the scoring metric that you're rated, which I think should never be the case, because so we often have this thing when I tell people how we're going to place people, and people are always concerned, like, how do you decide who goes to a project? I said, well, firstly, I don't play Magic the Gathering with you, and I definitely don't pick Pokemon. Like, you're not a 3-star Pikachu or Java versus a 2-star .NET, and there you go. That's definitely not how you decide on these things, and that's also important to keep in mind. And I think that's what a lot of developers are fighting for. They're saying, if there's standard metrics, I've had senior engineers that I know for a fact, if you put them in a hackathon, they will lose significantly to other senior engineers. But I know also for a fact, you put that senior in any team, delivery will be
make the whole team better. Yeah,
things will get done and will be on time, right? So it's not that this guy is less important than this guy. They're both senior engineers for what they bring to the table. However, they should be applied to different projects, domains, environments, customers.
so that's quite awesome. Like, so you have the scoring system, but it's sort of like an intuition pump. You say, okay, developers, pay attention to these categories. These are all important things to optimize for different reasons. And then it turns into a conversation instead of just like a ruler. And that's quite cool. Is there any time, actually, maybe let's jump over to VT, because I think that you've got some good opinions. So backstory, recently McKinsey released a report about how to measure dev team, did they say performance or productivity? I don't remember. Productivity, yeah. And that report spoke about a bunch of different frameworks of metrics and kind of combined them into one mega framework. And it got a lot of pushback. So got some pushback from VT. So let's hear about that.
Look, I think it's thank you. I think it's very difficult. I understand that where the need comes from in terms of being able to measure things, because people want predictability. Companies want predictability, and I think what everyone hates is the fact that, like, as a developer, my answer to almost everything is it depends, because we never really know. And I think to understand that, we need to look at the cycle of what happens in churning out features, right? So you almost have these 4 blocks. So you've got the effort, you've got your output, you've got your actual outcome, and the impact. So the effort will be like a lot of the planning work that goes into like introducing a new feature or a new product or anything like that. So it will be identifying a customer pain point. We realize that there's a gap here, and we estimate that if we do this, then we can extract this kind of value. And then you'd have things like estimation. We think it's going to take us 6 months. How do you know? Because we're developers, we're just guessing, right? And whether you're using t-shirt sizes or you're using Fibonacci or whatever, there will be some sort of effort to try and estimate the amount of work that would go into this. And I think I have a lot of opinions on that alone, in terms of people tying estimation effort to time as opposed to effort and things like that. And I think everyone has their own views, but you've got this effort block that has to go in. Then you've got your output, right? And I think in terms of effort, I don't think there's any value in actually measuring how good a team is. I think there are attempts, things like saying, we've seen that in the last couple of months, we're able to deliver consistently 50 points, whatever, a sprint, right? And that becomes a measure to say that if we estimate any sprint to be above 50 points, we won't be able to produce anything above that consistently. So you get that kind of cutoff, and I guess that could be valuable, but that means that everyone else is involved in that estimation, and over time it kind of evens out. But most teams don't do that. As a developer, you get to estimate your own tickets, meaning that if I estimate something, Sheena estimates something, it can be different. Then it's a useless metric to measure. But I think if we're estimating as a team and we're averaging it out, that could be one of the first metrics that we can use. And the second part is the output, right? So the actual artifacts that we produce, and this can be design documents, it can be the backlog itself, the product backlog, the code that we write, and I think people will try to measure things like that. Lines of code, I don't think really that is important, or there's anything really worth doing there, because worth measuring at that point, because really it's just like a byproduct. What Tina's or Simon the approach they might take might be different to the approach that I take. So like measuring lines of code or anything like that, I don't think it's worth it. I think where things get interesting is when it comes to outcome and impact, right? So we know that a lot of what we do, because the first thing that we do, the first ceremony is estimating, right? What we do is a lot of guesswork. And I think what's important in a delivery team or in a development team is for us to be able to validate our assumptions as quickly as possible. And this takes multiple forms. One of those forms is like internally within the teams, you want to be able to identify when you've broken something quickly. You want that fast feedback. So that's why some people will preach things like TDD, because I write some code, something breaks, I get immediate feedback, right? And then you've got the next cycle after that, which is like your QA team might be able to identify something, and if a customer gets stuck, then you want to get feedback quickly. And I think this is where you have in the outcome itself, you've got 3 metrics that you should be measuring, because the goal is being able to get feedback and knowing whether our guesses were good very early. Deployment frequency becomes important, because if it takes you 3 months to get something to the customer, it's just too long, right? So the more you can deploy, like if you can deploy multiple times a week or multiple times a day, it means that you're getting your product or your assumptions in the hands of the customers quickly. So definitely deployment frequency. The second one is lead time for changes, right? So if there's a new change that needs to be made in a system, whether it's testing a new feature or fixing a bug, right? What is the average time that it's taking your team to test this out, right? Because the quicker you can test out an idea, the cheaper it is for the company. And if it fails, it didn't cost you that much. And the third one is mean time to recover. I think, systems will go down. Even in the cloud, things will go down. And how long it takes for you to recover from an incident is very important as a team. And I think it's something that a team needs to get fit at, because every hour or whatever can be quantified in terms of money, right? Because our system was down for an hour, we're making this much an hour, it means that we potentially lost that much in an hour. And I think the last one is like the impact of the changes. Again, because we are guessing, you could be introducing something and you assume that it will make onboarding, it will introduce less friction to onboarding, and then people just end up getting stuck because the feature is confusing, right? So like that change failure rate, right? So how frequently do we put something in the hands of customers and then it just fails, and it either makes the process like bad or it confuses people or things like that. So I think for me, it's those. I think you could argue for things like velocity. If you are doing it consistently, you could measure that. That's in the effort box. And then in outcomes box is deployment frequency, lead time for changes, and mean time to recover. And then in the impact box, it would be the change failure rate.
Okay, that's cool.
Right.
That's quite. Go for it, Simon.
So I want to take a contentious position, but maybe if you have something to say it first.
I was just going to say, so those 4 metrics that VT was talking about, those come from Google's DevOps research and assessment team. So those are called the DORA metrics. So if anybody wants to look them up, DORA, I think that's also a fish. Yeah. And then the other thing is...
Those are also the metrics used in the McKinsey report, which is interesting.
Yeah. So they spoke about those and a bunch of other ones though as well. So I've heard some pushback to that report that are like, yeah, the DORA metrics are actually solid. But these other things, what are those? There's quite a bit in there. Simon, what's your contentious position?
So I want to take a very contentious position and defend lines of code as a metric briefly to illustrate a thought that I have. So a lot of what happens in software development is invisible, right? Kind of, we're building these kind of abstract systems by typing symbols onto keyboards, and we kind of can't really see what's happening. And a lot of modern systems are like that. So it's not just that the software is invisible, but also, for example, that most of the work that knowledge workers do and their interactions is also quite invisible. So for me, one of the important things about metrics is just to create some visibility, and to bring and with that visibility then to bring attention to things. So for lines of code, for example, I might say, look at the lines of code in, I don't know, the files in my directory, and I might kind of ask myself, like, why is serializer.py like 10,000 lines? Like, I know that there's a package that should do this, and then I might go have a look. I think what's also important if you're kind of looking at metrics just to get some visibility is to look at when things change. So you can look and be like, oh, the number of lines of code in this like part of the code base didn't change over 5 years. So I kind of know that this is a sort of mostly a kind of stable thing. Yeah, I think there's a lot of insight in practically almost any metric you choose to look at, because you might discover something, and just actually paying some extra attention to this invisible process almost always helps, almost no matter what you do. Yeah,
that makes sense. So it's like it's a useful bit of information, and we can use it to sniff out some problems or some good things. But to optimize for lines of code is probably, I don't think it is contentious at all to say optimizing for a certain number of lines of code is a bad thing. Because if you pay people per line of code, or you're like, give us more lines, then people will. And that's kind of an issue. I think there's probably a couple of anti-patterns that come up in this whole performance measurement thing. And I think like lines of code might be it's something that some people might want to rely on too heavily, but I think maybe that boat has sailed. I think people have moved on from wanting to measure that. Are there any anti-patterns around velocity? So VT mentioned it earlier, and I see Africa's unmuting herself. Yes, this is your time.
Just itching. As VT spoke to velocity earlier, I was like, I see where you're coming from. However, there are others. And I think it kind of speaks to the question around anti-patterns, Sheena, just in the sense that I think in a team sense, velocity is okay to look at because it's kind of like your guiding lights as to, this is where we typically can land in terms of what we are capable of doing in terms of the work being done within a sprint. That's all fine and dandy. But some of the scary things I've seen as well is, finding stakeholders in organizations that, have multiple teams that are doing things, start to compare those teams against each other and say, well, team A is able to push out 50 story points a sprint. Team B, how come you're only pushing out 25? And I think it's kind of like the job then to continuously coach the thinking that it's not about how much stuff you're doing and completing at the end of the sprint, but are we consistently meeting our sprint goals? Are we adding value at the end of the sprint? Is the impact that you guys, foresaw with us doing the stuff that we said we were going to do actually being realized come the end of the sprint? So I think it's so important to kind of have that conversation and help coach the thinking, because it's so easy to fall into the box of, oh yeah, well, you guys should all be aiming for 75 story points, and that's how we know we're doing a great job. But I think at the end of the day, it lies in the value, and it lies in the fact that teams are different. What team A can do is not the same as team B or C or D. And the second, the team makeup changes as well, that's going to issue in a whole new different set of things within a team that gets brought in as well. And so productivity could end up, taking a little bit of a dip. But that doesn't mean that the value that is being seen at the end of it as well is going to follow that same trend. So I think it's just so important to have those, thoughts in mind as well.
That makes sense. So I think like with velocity specifically, it seems like things can go horribly wrong in a few different ways. So I think the one way, so you're talking about different teams having different velocities, but often those teams would also be calculating story points in slightly different ways. They would be told like that's a 1 and that's a 5, but then maybe they round everything up in this team and they round everything down in that team. Like little changes to how things go. Or maybe there's just a louder voice in one team who's very convincing and very good at saying like, oh no, that's easy. So like things can go sideways like that. And I think, yeah, so people can end up being compared in an unfair way. And then the other thing BT was talking about earlier with velocity is that like sometimes people just aren't that good at estimating story points and going through that process in a rigorous way. So it's like maybe you just skip the ritual of voting on story points and you just say like, yeah, this feels like a 3 to me, I'll take it. And then Timus is like, I think that one's a 5, I'll take it. And so if you don't have a consistent, like if there isn't agreement among individuals in the team, it's also kind of a bit of a mess. Yeah.
Sorry, just to interject there, Sheena. Look, I think one of the anti-patterns that you have when it comes to estimating velocity and all of that is the fact that we try to make it what we want it to be, but words have meaning, right? So like velocity is about speed given a direction. And I think when it comes to velocity, when it comes in a team or in a delivery team rather, I don't think it's about accurately estimating or even like agreeing. It's just like whatever technique that you use, it's neither good or bad as long as you do it consistently, right? So if in our team how we choose story points is I think that's a 3, I'll grab it, and Tina says I think that's a 5 and I'll grab it. As long as we continuously and consistently do that, it'll be fine. It will give us the speed at which we're going as a team. Because even if we're bad at estimating, what we rely on is that we want to be consistently bad. And if we're good, we want to be consistently good. Because like as long as you're consistent over time, right, it should even out and it should be able to give you that measure because the things would average. And I think the biggest mistakes that leaders of teams make is thinking more story points means that better performance as a team, as opposed to saying that like we know that whatever story points mean, and it might mean different things and it will mean different things to different teams. We know that as a team within this bubble of ours, we can deliver 70 story points. How we arrive at the 70 points doesn't matter as long as we are consistently arriving it in the same way, right? Then we can measure, because as soon as you go above 70, you know that work won't be done. And I think people need to be comfortable with the fact that story points they are very arbitrary and they don't need to mean anything. We just need to be consistent as a team.
I think for me, kind of a stable velocity for a team is an indication that kind of the team is sort of stable and in kind of a sort of a kind of flow state where kind of the work is sort of flowing evenly, which is usually a good thing, because I think one of the things that can go wrong in software development is things can be easily far too chaotic. But it doesn't necessarily mean that flow state is kind of the best state. It can also sometimes be a very comfortable, like kind of mediocre state. And yeah, it's also something I maybe wanted to broaden things out a bit again. So I think one of the things we've touched on a few times here is the thing which I call success metrics. So it's a metric that you use to kind of evaluate success. So So, I mean, we've spoken about how, say, lines of code is a very bad success metric and how velocity has its dangers. But I think in success metrics are kind of inherently dangerous, because success is not something that you can capture in one number. And if you create kind of a number for people to optimize, and if you put too much pressure on optimizing that number, people will optimize it because you kind of pressurize them to do so, and it will no longer capture the reality that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, it makes sense. People do tend to optimize for the wrong thing. Dennis, yeah?
It's a good point, and I think it's I like that we're going in this direction, because I think I also kind of touched on it when you spoke about different product owners. And now, to your point, the thing that comes to mind immediately is people with their sales targets. We need to hit so much revenue or sales by a certain date, and that's a very clear metric, right? Where how you get there is irrelevant. But with us, the kind of work, and I think this is where the frustration comes in, is we are all talking at it because of where we come from a dev perspective, as someone who's on the team, who's writing code. As developers and engineers, it is critical that we put on the lens and glasses of the people that are other concerned with this thing. Your customer, depending on who they are and what their business is and what they're trying to achieve, to your point, Simon, their success criteria would mean something completely different to the thing. I figure you've got these two product owners, even in the same company, I can guarantee you success looks different. And oftentimes the pressure that they put on teams comes from the pressure that they are facing. So let's say you've got these two teams, and this division is happy, and this division is like they're exceeding budget significantly. And let's be honest, guys, software engineers are not the cheapest resource, people out there. It's a high-paying job for high-paying, intelligent people. So people are going to look at software engineers saying, "Cool, I'm paying a lot of money for people. What value are they providing for me out of it?" And if you're in a team, if your job on the team is to say, "Okay, I want to make sure my team is as efficient and productive as possible," then velocity, estimation, story points, ways of work, structure is critical. But at the end of the day, the customer on the side might be looking for the lens. If you work for a company where your customer is external, will never see them, let's say you build product, let's say Apple or Amazon or whatever, you're going to once again take on a very different lens, because no one's going to give a crap how effective your velocity or story points is if your competitor is beating you to market or whatever the case may be. So I think that first step, what is success criteria look for us as a team, for us as a customer, and for those people around us. So I know, for example, Intellect is something that we have to always drill into new people when they join us, because when they go into review season, there is no checklist. There is no small metric like this. It's very broad thing that they have to review each other on, and they often struggle. They're like, "Okay, what does this mean?" So, in our sense, and I'll consolidate for it, but it's like three things. It's like, what is your competence in your craft? Whether you're a PA or a Scrum Master, whether you're a team lead, whether you're whatever, and it's rated by your peer, right? So how does your team perceive your effectiveness and competence in whatever it is that you do? Then you've got, what is your impact on others? What is your impact on the team? So if you function in a way, and this is where we get to velocity, you get rockstar 10x engineer. He knocks out 70 points, their entire team does 70. He doubles it, right? But this guy is a proper asshole. He doesn't help the juniors. He doesn't show anything. He doesn't give a crap. He won't respond to a query or whatever. Like, the team is kind of like going down with their own velocity because this guy is being as efficient for himself as possible. So we'd like to bring that in as a metric, because it's not just how you act, especially if you'll agree that software engineering is a complex, collaborative environment space. Then the impact that you as an engineer on the people that you work with is critical. And then thirdly, what is your impact that you bring? Whether you're a graduate software engineer, or you're the solution architect, what's your impact that you bring to customer success? And that would be the one metric we look at. And what that means, you have to define, because I'm not going to replicate that for each customer, because everyone has a very different environment. I know, BT, you come from consulting, which is where I come from, so we often take that lens of a consulting team mindset, but if we talk about dev teams in general, there's many dev teams out there where they're paying customers very happy as long as they knock out their WordPress website or their CMS system or this thing, right? And then they're happy to pay for the value. It is what they produce. I think where we're talking is our engineering teams that live in a bit more of a complex environment, often in large enterprise systems, and where there is complexity. I've seen too many times where I've spoken to a team and they complain about pressure from the client, whatever, and you speak to them, it's like, well, what is your client's pressure point? Like, what do you mean? Like, you're saying you're not getting time with your product owner. Is your product owner just lazy and doesn't like you, or is he actually under pressure and he's in 20 other meetings with 20 other products to manage? And the fact that you keep talking to him about your pipelines is really irrelevant to him at this point in his life. And if you understand the metric, you can pivot. You could produce 20 code story points, but you could provide 80 points of value in their life by saying, okay, cool, they're facing other issues. We could automate this thing or create a reporting structure. I think as developers, we often are in danger of not defining our own success criteria, and therefore other people are now trying to come up with metrics to define our success criteria for us and then hold us accountable to that. But I mean, can you blame the poor guy? Like, he studied economics, he's running this group, and he has no idea, he doesn't even know what code looks like, and now you're trying Agile and Scrum and all these things. I think it's very important for us to also take the lens of where this is coming from. And if you look at the McKinsey report, consultancy group, they clearly have customers that are saying, hey, my biggest line item every year is software engineers and developers. I need to know, am I getting the most out of it, because this is where I'm investing all my money, and help me do this. And that's probably the lens with which they approach this thing. If you're leading a software team, have that foresight to say, okay, cool, I have 3 things to concern myself about. One is this team's efficiency and velocity. And I mean, you might tell people for their growth. So earlier I alluded to the fact that, I've never heard of a dev saying, I don't want to hear that I can improve, or this is how I can get better. And I think that's a good measurement. Mm-hmm. So if you're a team where this is your culture, that you want to get better, everyone wants to grow their knowledge, people want to expose themselves to more, they want to do more. Simon touched on an interesting point about, if you're only doing 70 velocity points, then you kind of stagnant, you're not stretching yourself. And I think where that comes in is that's the deep human drive every single one of us has, is to want to get better. We don't want to do what we did last year 10 times over. Right? We want to go that extra mile. So where's the new challenge? Because it's overcoming that challenge that makes you look at, like, hey, I'm a useful human being. Like, I can actually do something with it. That's the concept which we look at it. So it's tough to then ask people to review in that metric, but in our world, and we have to look at in the intellect, we have 200 projects on the go at any given time, and there's hundreds of customers. It's not like I can paint that blank metric and say we're going to measure you against these points, because it'll be very unfair. Afika, you're sitting in the banking and medical insurance space, whatever, right? So comparing you to someone who's sitting in agriculture as a developer and having to deal with people that they can't get hold of because they're on a tractor somewhere in a field in the Free State is a different type of consideration that you have to take into mind when you develop these things. So if that team finds a way to better effectively communicate with their customer and get them the stuff in a manner that they understand, even if they deliver less, I would see that as a bigger success for that team than someone who's in a corporate environment where everyone's behind a laptop and everyone's on Teams calls and in conversations like that. So I think a first step for us as engineers, if we don't like being measured by these external sources, giving people reasons to go and look for these measurement sources, like providing this is what we want to achieve by the team. Next 3-4 months, we want to get this for your system. We know we brought us in because these things are, we want to get there, and we will align with you every sprint to make sure we're aligned to our ultimate goal. Because your velocity points, no one's going to remember you did 60 points in January, 2023. They're going to care. They're going to care about what you delivered come December 2023.
We've spoken quite a lot about, I guess, defining success, which is quite hard. But I think I kind of have, but it's sometimes also interesting for me to think about recognizing when things are going wrong. So maybe defining success is hard, but I think finding what is wrong or seeing that something is wrong is possibly a bit easier. So I actually have a question for Afika. Kind of see one of the Scrum Master's biggest roles is to pick up when things are going wrong as early as possible. So my question is, what do you look for when you're looking at a team to what are the things which you see which make your sort of spider senses tingle and make you go like, oh, this team is in trouble or needs help?
Yeah, that's a good one, Simon. and maybe I'll take just a little bit of a different stance in terms of perspective. I think it's almost easy to see when things are not going too great. If it's things like bugs that are consistently coming back in the team, if it's things like tech debt that is skyrocketing and all of that kind of stuff. But I find those to be like lag indicators, right? Because stuff has already gone wrong. Now we need to fix it and be reactive. Whereas, from my standpoint, I look at the softer side of life. And I want to know, how is this team gelling? Are we talking over each other? Are we not giving each other the opportunity to actually fully get our thoughts out before we kind of like jump down each other's throats and start saying what the other one thinks? Because that to me already indicates some kind of communication breakdown. And if there's a little bit of a communication breakdown, then there's something that's not being fully understood, which then raises the opportunity for things down the line to go a little bit wrong. So already up then and up front, it's a conversation of, okay, guys, I hear that you're all passionate about everything that you guys are thinking right now, but let's take a step back and actually take a moment to hear and understand where everybody is coming from before we just kind of automatically shut the conversation down. I also look for the way in which they speak to each other, right? So it's all good and dandy if you let everybody finish their sentence, but if you kind of wait your turn and then say, yeah, but that already to me kind of triggers but did you really hear what they were trying to say? So it's the manner in which we're engaging with each other. Are we engaging in yes and behavior and trying to build on things, or are we butting each other and trying to completely eradicate what the previous person said so that we can get our thoughts in upfront as well? So it's those little tweaks. Also, just seeing if there's an element of trust within the team. Do you trust that if Tina said to you that you will get this thing by such and such a date, are you constantly nagging him every single day at stand up? Hey, I'm waiting for this thing. How far are you? And Tina starts getting all aggro with you and saying, dude, I said you'd get it by such and such a date. Those kinds of things that start to kind of highlight a little bit of a bubbling under of a lack of trust within the team. And I like to look at things like Peter Drucker's, 5 dysfunctions of a team as well, with all of those elements. And I think it's so, so, so important to tune into those, because the second we don't have those elements that all really are underlined and underpinned with trust, that is very, very dangerous territory. And it takes one wrong move, Simon, and then we're just kind of buggered as a team as well. So, those are the things typically, and I'm sure that there's so much more. I'll have to give it a little bit more of a think.
That's awesome. I think it's highlights some pretty important things. I think, psychological safety on a team is pretty critical. And like software is a team sport in the end. Like you can, from time to time, like go off on a mission on your own and build a big thing. But generally speaking, you're going to be working on a team. And so that culture matters a lot. And I think also just on what Tunis was saying earlier, the fact that devs often need to, like dev performance needs to be clear in a way to people who aren't devs, so like the business brains and whatnot in the organization. I think that's a very tricky thing, which is why people like Timus are very, very useful to have around. It's like I can speak dev and I can speak business also. So I think if you are a developer, I know that there are a lot of junior developers hanging out here and watching this, like work on those communication skills. It's really worthwhile, like really worthwhile. I think, Simon, you wanted to add something, but I'm also quite keen to get some questions from the audience. I see one question and one good point. Are you all good? All right, sweet. So here is a question from Kyle Hughes. Can one use atomic commits in combination with TDD as a useful performance metric? Who feels like taking that?
I mean, like I'll take it, right? Like once again, Carl, I'd say yes. If your goal is you have a junior engineer and your objective is to help this guy and coach him on his technical competence, I'd say yes. If you're using this to score someone as how they performed over a period, I'd say no. It's way too granular, and you're measuring something that could incentivize the wrong behavior. Because now someone who becomes really useful with their atomic commitments and puts all the effort into following a pure TDD approach, as an example, might provide less business value, because we know there's always the death march that comes when the big release is happening. The company has put up billboards, it's in the news, the app is launching that day, and you're not going to delay that release no matter what. So I'd say yes, it can be used for performance metrics. I'd say it's a danger to blatantly say that this is the type of performance metric that should be used. I'd say if your intent is to help grow the person, and that's your benevolent intent, then yes.
I would say they can definitely be used as a metric. I mean, it's a number that you can make. I would definitely not use it as a performance metric.
Yeah, agreed with you. That's better phrased.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think this question can be interpreted as like looking at the commits made by individuals on the team, and I don't think it's ever really a good idea to pit team members against each other in any way and say like, oh, this one made more commits than this one.
Yeah.
Because it really is a team sport. So maybe there's somebody on the team who's just like, they don't write as much code as the others, but they're always like, they know the system and they're helping everyone else out, so there's all sorts of ways for people to, maybe there's somebody in the stand-ups who's diffusing sticky situations, like that's freaking powerful too, and that's not writing code. So that's cool. And then there's a comment here which is maybe going to be contentious, but let's see how it goes. Oh no, wrong one. Wait a second. This one. Stable velocity is an anti-pattern. You want to always ensure consistent flow of delivery, but the part of the flow that people miss is that it can be increased and decreased, but must be predictable. So this is a tricky thing, because I suppose as soon as you see that velocity number, you're like, where are the levers? What can I pull on to shift it around? And I think that it can be too, sometimes you can shift it in a predictable way and say like, okay, just for this little while, we're going to work really, really hard. We're going to pull in some extra hours, but that's dangerous as well. So, for example, let's say you've got a team of 5. If you add another person, it's not going to increase your velocity by 20%. And if you add 20% more hours, it's not going to increase your velocity by 20% because people are going to get tired. So, yeah, like I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on this. Maybe Africa.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah.
Go for it, Fikile. I was just going to say, 9 ladies don't make a baby in 1 month. That's all.
Yeah.
That's exactly it, right? Just throwing a whole bunch more things into the pot doesn't make the food cook quicker. In fact, it does the exact opposite, right? And I think that's the thing people think happens. If there's more people like tapping away on the laptop, then that must mean we're going to get a whole bunch of stuff and velocity is going to be great and the whole shebang. But I think in the sense that, stable velocity is an anti-pattern, for me, what that means is also like the whole point of us working in this agile way is we believe in continuous improvement. And if you're working in a state of a constant stable velocity, then what are we continuously improving? That means we're kind of just comfortable in this place of stagnancy as well. And that, I think, for me is a little bit of the fear factor when people are like, okay, cool, this is our velocity, this is what we're going to do every sprint. Where are we trying to improve? Where are we trying to grow? Where are we trying to do a little bit better as well? And I think the second you add another person to a team, I mentioned the 5 dysfunctions of a team a little bit earlier on. When you have a long-standing team, you've gotten to the point of we understand how each other's each other works. We know how to engage with each other. We know how to support one another. We know our kind of strengths and weaknesses and where we balance each other out. We've worked with each other for so long that we've gotten to a place where we have developed this trust. We're no longer scared of getting into tiffs here and there because we understand that the problem is the problem, not each other, and we're not pointing at one another. You're finding a team where people are so much more willing to be, accountable and all these other elements that the second you enter in another human into that dynamic, it shifts things because we don't know you and you don't know us. And as much as you might think that everything is a little bit cut and dry in terms of, okay, cool, here's this other person. People are people at the end of the day, and the environment has as much to do with their output performance, if you want to put it that way, as what actually needs to be done as well. So it's so important, I think, to remember that just adding another human means you're adding all these other areas. Your team almost instantly goes back to forming stage, and then you need to work back to storming and norming, and eventually you'll start performing. And it's all those little elements that all lead up to how a team kind of over time starts to gradually produce consistent results.
That's awesome.
Cool.
I'm going to pass on the onboarding a new team member question, because I think onboarding team members is worthy of its whole own episode, or maybe more than one. But I did want to chime in a bit on the stable velocity. So I think stable velocity can be a good thing, and for me it depends a lot on kind of what that stable velocity is, sort of what is driving that stable velocity from kind of beneath. And for me, the good stable velocity is kind of the team or in a good working flow, and they kind of know what they're working on. But various things can disrupt that, and some of those are good. So for me, one of the good disruptions is I expect velocity to completely go out the window if the team take on a big new challenge. If they're doing something they haven't done before or trying technology they haven't used, I expect there to be a big velocity wobble. And if I didn't, I would be suspicious.
That's cool. I was also thinking about velocity as, so there's got to be a ceiling to how fast you can go. You can't just keep on ramping up and doing more and more and more with the same team forever. There will be a tangent. You will stop at some point going up, and you'll reach something like a steady state. If you try to force things and go faster, then do you want to know what one of my worst words is? Sprint. Because it just sounds unsustainable. We should call them jogs. Because you want to just keep
trail
going
running.
for a while. Yeah. So
I think.
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry to interrupt. I think people always, when referring to Brooks' law around adding people, and I've heard the 9 women can't make a baby in a month type of thing, is that it seems like we forget that there were actually 4 graphs in the Mythical Men Month, and the context was very important. I think people always quote the worst case scenario. I think the Brooks law actually says adding manpower late in the project, right? And I think there's that keyword about late. So if you're 7 months into a 9-month project, adding double the number of people in the team doesn't necessarily make you go faster, but that doesn't mean that it can't go faster. I think it actually, Brooks law very much relates to Amdahl's law, which talks about processes, right? So if you have a system, and the reason why now we want multi-core CPUs is because that work that can be parallelized will be parallelized, and that will be faster. And I think that applies to human beings as well, right? So if there's work that can be done in parallel in a team, then adding an extra person can make things faster, and it can improve your velocity. If you just have a bunch of developers who are just developers who can write code, but are maybe not as clued up in terms of like the infrastructure. And we're seeing that come up now, where if you're doing serverless, if you're writing Lambda or anything like that, suddenly you can't just be an engineer anymore. You also need to understand the impact that your decisions has on underlying infrastructure, and that can impact your productivity, your delivery, whatever as a team. Adding a specialist cloud engineer can actually come and help you, right? Because they will be able to identify issues. I think I lean more towards thinking that stable velocity is a good thing, especially if your team is mature, right? Over time, I don't think you look at velocity and you're like, we want to increase velocity. I think, from my understanding, is that velocity exists to measure how fast we can go as a team. And when your speedometer says that you're going at 120 kilometers an hour, your aim is not to go 140 or whatever. It's for you to know how fast you're going, and you can therefore calculate how long it's going to take you to get to your destination, right? And sure, maybe you won't reach your destination in time, and maybe you still have a bit of leeway and you can increase a bit of speed there. But I don't think in teams, the point of measuring productivity is to pull on levers and go faster, but more around to create predictability as to, are we actually in a kind of space where we can hit our goals by doing this? Or can we change the team structure to reach that goal without reaching diminishing returns, right? Because, yeah, sure, if you're in the planning phase of the project, then it's good for you to plan for the right amount of resource with a team, right? But if that work can't be parallelized, it doesn't matter, right? Because then like everyone else you add to the team will just wait. But there is a case to say that, yes, if we add the right skills to the project early enough in the project, then we can kind of get that speed advantage, right? And then if you are running a 6-month project, you want to actually avoid trying to fiddle with that team a lot, because then you introduce that disruption. There's the whole thing around that Afika mentioned around the 5 dysfunctions of a team. It takes a very long time to build trust, and adding one person can be disruptive to the whole thing. So I think in the planning phase, yeah, sure, but late in the project, you want to try and avoid to do that. I actually read somewhere where someone was asked how, like, can they add more people to the team to go faster? And the manager actually said, I would like you to remove some people, right, in order for us to hit our goals, because of the lines of communication that exist within a team. And having fewer lines of communication can sometimes actually improve your velocity, because your velocity might be low because of the amount of waiting that exists in the team. So I think what's important is that someone who's a dev manager needs to be aware of how the team is collaborating, the lines of communication, the amount of skill that exists within the team, where everyone's weak points and strong points are. And I think I've said a lot, but to finish, I think as a dev manager, you want to make sure that your team achieves flow. And the only way for you to do that is to not look for flow yourself, but to be interrupt driven, so that you can identify these areas of optimization that will allow your team to maintain flow.
Also, I want to grab one question from the audience before we run out of time, which is from Sile.
There it is.
I think this question about open source team is a really good lens, because clearly they do function in rather different ways. And I would like to do like a whole conversation about kind of like open development communities. But I think how that ties into what we've been discussing here is that it's really important to think about what kind of creates like really good development experiences from not the lens of metrics, but just kind of a more qualitative lens. So when the developers understand the problem they're solving and are passionate about it, you don't necessarily need much else. But creating those things, there are certain kinds of things, I think, like let's say GitHub. Like GitHub is kind of the dream project, because all of the developers you hire are your users. So you can get away without having to explain everything to them. And I think open source projects succeed by sort of selecting for that. They're often projects which are kind of developer focused, where developers are the users, not always. And there's things that developers are passionate about. And if you have those, you kind of have all the right ingredients. And it's probably a good thing to think about inside businesses too. Like, how do we get developers the knowledge they need to succeed? And how do we get them excited about it?
That's cool. So it's useful to hire developers who are passionate about your problem area and not just about the tech.
Yeah.
Tina, so you're going to say something?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd like to tie on what VT and Simon have been saying, and also point out something Sister wrote in that last comment where he said about the metrics aren't for us, they're for the sponsors or whatever. And I think it's very important that you take this approach. So now, something that's come up, Fika, you've mentioned the 5 dysfunction of a team. We've mentioned velocity. Simon, you've talked about as VT, you spoke about trust. Simon, you spoke about like quality and passion and whatever. And Fika, at some point you mentioned teamwork and trust and collaboration. Now, I'm going back to, and I'm not touting this. I'm not saying this is a solution, but go and experiment this. What Health Check model does really well is it takes these things. So the metrics that are in there that I can pick off my head, right, would be teamwork, client relations, ease of release, continuous deployment, communication, access to expertise. So VT, you now mentioned like bringing in cloud specialists, whatever, growth. There's a few of those metrics that they had, and at Entler we've had a few of our own. But I think every single team, whether you do a health check or whatever, you can go and pinpoint what are these things that matter to us, and then what are these things that matter to our customers. Let's measure them, because velocity will probably be critical for something that we need to improve within 2 months' time. But is the lemon worth the squeeze once you're at a steady velocity and the team's not unhappy and no one's unhappy? And maybe the issue is not actually the story points and whatever that is that's coming up, but the issue is like, hey, our demos suck. Our customers don't understand what we're trying to show them, and they're giving us the wrong feedback. Why are we focusing our attention on here? And I think if you have those series of metrics, and that's all the health check does, it gives a team that series of metrics that they care about. And one is now good enough. Great. Guys, let's stop fixing that one. Let's not degrade it, because if it does, next month we'll catch it. But let's start looking at client relations. The last demo didn't go well, our client escalated and the product owner is upset, and all right, we have to do something in that space. So let's make effort in our sprint to address those concerns, make our demos better. Yes, it's very important to hire developers with passion and whatever, but bad teams can kill passion very quickly.
Yeah.
I've had to deal with people where they just said, I don't want to do this anymore, whatever. Maybe I don't even want to do software engineering anymore. And that is an unbelievably big failure from leaders inside a space when that happens to an individual, when someone's passion gets dissolved. So yes, it's important hiring the person with passion, but it's very important giving people that sense of passion. And the only concern that goes in the back of my head, and this is the people in culture management speaking, and when you say steady velocity, whatever, it's like the people I've dealt with that are happy and content are not people that have an easy job per se, where they do the same thing every single day. I actually see it's people that get put challenges and struggles, and they actually don't win. They have to battle it out a bit, and then they succeed, and then they feel, you know what I do is meaningful, and I am growing as a person. And then if you can tie that to a larger objective and not make it a release or a sprint problem, but by deploying this number of code, we realize that we have changed 2 million people's lives who will access this thing, right? You as a human being have contributed to that. Those things are very important because they tie the picture together. And if you're older and you're more senior, then what typically tends to happen is people get, I know it matters, but I've built many systems. So that's something as a team you guys have to work on, make them the interaction with the team meaningful. And then for juniors, they often struggle to see that big picture. So it's very important for the people to try and translate that to them. The point is, have metrics you care about. Whether you're a consultancy, you're a product house, you're a small startup, you're a dev team, define what matters for you and what your success is, and also never forget to throw in that flavor of what you can be the best at. Because different people have different attributes, right? Like if we had a whole team of Tina says, I'm telling you, there's a bunch of things that we do terribly. I'm going to guarantee you that. So then we'll have to pivot and find the things that we know that we'll be good at, and we'll build our identity, or when we speak about culture around that. I always hate the term culture, especially me with my title, gets confused with socials and having fun and whatever, and that's not true. That's not true. The way you onboard someone, the way you engage, pair programming, the way people work together, the relationship you build with your customer, going to work and saying, you know, guys, today we contribute something meaningful. We didn't. Sometimes you could not write one line of code. You could have a workshop session with your product owner, stakeholder, solution architects, and you could do that for a day and walk away thinking this was a very productive day. No lines of code, no velocity points hit, none of that stuff. But it matters to your team. And maybe in a workspace where that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. My point is, if you as a group of people, you don't have to wait for a team or a consultancy or a company to define what your measurement performance is going to be, what's going to impact your bonus. Define what's going to matter to you personally, and then what to you as a team. Where does your value structures lie, and what things are important to you, and then measure those things, as arbitrary as they might be. Opinions, if trust is difficult to measure, then your opinion, like, I don't think I can trust you, that's a metric. I can trust you, that's also a metric that you can score on. So I'd really like to encourage people, and if you don't know where to start, that health check model is open source. It's been there. Have a look at it. It is useful. But define your own one, and I think then you could have, break these things down, because I think why we're struggling, why everyone's struggling, is it's a lot of little problems. There's a lot of little things, how your deployment works, how this person works. A new person comes in, and you mentioned new person could delay them. I guess the big uncertainty is we don't know who we're going to get. And maybe we're getting the cloud specialist that knows how we work, but maybe we're getting a cloud specialist that thinks we need to scrap everything we've done the last 8 months and rebuild onto AWS because it's better than Azure. And you're like, well, that's not going to make us go faster at all. Right? So the human element is a factor. You cannot take it away. In our line of work, none of us are smart enough to solve all the problems. But what we can do is know what we're doing, what's easy for us, it might not be easy for someone else. And knowing what that is, or our perception might be different for someone else, knowing what that is a great first step to address your problem.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think one thing you left me wondering is you have health checks within your teams. Do you have health checks with the whoever the teams report to? So do you have health check metrics, or like a health check process where you ask the clients like, hey, red, green, or orange on these things? Yeah, that's cool.
Yes and no, context specific. So some places we wouldn't do that, some places we would do that. And also, even on a team level inside Intellect itself, not every team would include the managers in a health check. And it's fine. There's a reason for it. People are in different states of their maturity in their team, and some teams are on that point, and the relationships are such that they welcome the manager into those sessions, or the manager's happy to look at it. What the important thing of the health check that we do is, especially pre-COVID, now everything's Miro, which dilutes it a little bit in my opinion, but we had to, on the board, you had your little graphs, and you could see, support was green, and now it's amber, or it's red, or it's going up and going down. And that was useful, whether managers see it when they walk by or not, whether you see it. The most important thing is, like, if you're going to measure anything, if you don't revisit it and check where you're going in the direction, then it almost was a wasted exercise. So to your question, sometimes we have some of our customers give feedback in on the individual. For us personally, because of our values the way it is, and we also know, like, different environments, different situations, we might not share that with the individual or even market as relevant. Sometimes you would. Most customers don't know what to say. So I love Afika. She's such an amazing human being. Keep at it, which is also not really relevant to her. She's not really going to take anything from that other knowing, okay, great, like that person likes you. So I think, we don't do health checks. What we do with health checks is we have the ability for guests. So you don't need an Intellect account to go do this health check system. You could invite, let's say, this panel, or you could invite your product owner, or you invite other, when you don't often just work with people from your own organization, into that session, and they could all give their input anonymously, which is useful if you want to have a fruitful discussion. But yeah, the trust relation definitely needs to be there if you want to be effective at that.
We're going to grab another question from the audience. And I think this is also, it's related to some things that we've said recently as well, about like if our velocity is something that is unsustainable, then burnout happens. And I do think it's burnout usually happens because like sometimes they are just disasters and we have to deal. But sometimes it is because of mismanagement and just expecting too much of a velocity. But yeah, does anybody want to talk? Let's go with Africa again. Would you like to talk on this?
Yeah, sure, I'll go for it. The burnout.
Yeah, like how do you spot it in your teams if somebody's struggling?
When people are a little more assholey than usual. For lack of a better term. Look, I think burnout for different people can present itself in different ways. And that's where the beauty of knowing your team comes into play. I also don't think it's necessarily always the job of, your scrum master or the leader in the team to be able to pick up everybody's nuances, right? Because we're but mere mortals. It's almost like a collective communal effort to look after each other. And we should be able to call it out and say, hey, you're not looking too great. Are you all right? What's going on? What's popping? And for me, that is, I think, the whole reason why we work in the way that we work, right? We've got all these lovely values that put individuals and interactions before all these other fancy schmancy things. And it's because at the end of the day, people need other people in order to be able to thrive. We are not islands. And we need that community in order to be able to be the best version of ourselves. So for me, I think in terms of identifying it, it can just be as simple as me seeing how you walk in one particular day and being like, no, that's not right. In terms of, recovering and regrouping, I'm going to say something very dangerous and then I'm going to take a sidestep. In SAFE, right? They have this after all of these awesome little what's it, PIs that they do and whatever.
Program implements.
Thank you. After all those little steps, there's like a little bit of an innovation period as well, where people get to, I think the reasoning behind that is because they realize that you can't just keep pushing people and pushing and pushing and pushing all the time. At some point, they need to take a step back. And I think Tina's touched on it a little bit. When he spoke to the fact that, at some point it has to be about a little bit more for people as well. And so I think what, that innovation period offers is for people to let out that creativity a little bit, think about their purpose a little bit, feel their hair in the wind, if you will. And so I think, and this now is my sidestep, when it comes to recovering and regrouping, when you see that burnout is happening, take a step back. I think that's okay. I think it's very much needed as well. I think as a team, you need to be able to play a little bit, have a good time. I am a huge fan of doing what we love and having fun while we're doing it as well. We have to be around each other all day, every day. So you might as well have a good time, right? And where you can find those little pockets of joy to usher in an opportunity for us to be able to breathe a little bit, use that. Whether it's a retro every now and then that lets you just kind of, decompress. I think that's an awesome opportunity. If you want to spice up your ceremonies with a really cool, energizing icebreaker, go for it. Whatever it takes, depending on your audience and the people in your team that would energize them, then go for it. Have that opportunity to breathe, because then that reminds people in the team that, oh, they do recognize me as a human being and not a mere resource that can be used and then thrown to the side once they're done with me, So I think it's just so important to be able to energize as a team, and have the opportunity as self, so a little bit of self-management too, to take a step back, and realize what are the things that are your energy takers and energy givers, and how do you replenish that as well, and lean into those elements.
I think VT has his hand up
I just
earlier.
okay, go for it, VT. But I think we're both itching to.
No, this was before. It was more when Tinas was talking about the health checks. I will touch a bit on burnout. I think for me, the problem is most people try to recover from burnout at work. I think when you're burnt out, take time off. Like just take leave, step away from the computer. It's okay. It's good for people to, just disconnect from work. Sometimes I'm a big fan of going for walks. So there's the company I work for now, Demon. There's a huge emphasis on well-being. So they will encourage things like if you're going to be in a team meeting and you don't need to be sat in front of the computer, go for a walk. Take walk. Like they encourage more walking meetings. They'd encourage you to take a walk, to take a meeting while going for a coffee run, just to step away from the screen a bit. And I think that's where that burnout comes from. We sit in front of our computers for 8, 12, 16 hours, and we wonder why we're so tired. And I think sometimes, you just need to go outside and touch grass. Like that's all, right? And relax a bit. More on the team health checks. I'm a big fan of that. Tinas, we 3 years ago, me and the managing director at the time, we're working together again now at Demon. We devised a method that we're using now still, which was like 2 ways, right? So measuring your team health check, but in a very simple, non-intrusive way. So at the team level, it would be the red, amber, green, in terms of where are you with your goals and how are you tracking? And so that would be accompanied by a RAID log, right? So identifying any risks, any issues, any key decisions being made and things like that. And that RAID log for that week would inform whether something's green. And look, if something's green, you don't need to really look at it. Whoever's doing the oversight. If it's amber, then suddenly it's like, okay, something might be happening here. And if it's red, it definitely needs immediate attention. And then from the client side, because we work in consulting, we really simply ask for a number rating out of 10 at the end of every sprint, right? Overall, not focus on an individual, as a team. How do you feel the team is doing out of 10? And when that drops below 5, suddenly it's an indication that there's something you probably need to investigate. But if it's above like a 7 or 8, then it's an indication that the team is doing generally well.
Yeah, no, I like that, dude. I like that.
I want to say something about burnout because I think I have something quite important to say. Everyone here has spoken a lot about kind of various kinds of self-management, and sure, getting off the hamster wheel in various ways is important. But I think in practice, what I've seen happen the most often, and what has caused the most serious burnout, is that the rate or the manner in which work is arriving at the team is not fit for the team. And for me, burnout is usually a management problem. And if you are in a situation where the work is arriving kind of in a bad way, it's kind of management's job to fix that. And there's not that much the team can do about it by themselves. I mean, they can have good conversations with management, but I would say probably kind of one of the number one, well, probably I'd say there's 2 ways that you kind of lose people. One is not challenging them enough, which Tina spoke about a lot. And the other is kind of throwing the wrong kind of work at them, which, And I think the other thing is quite hard. Well, it seems to be quite hard for managers to fix. And I don't quite know like how to suggest at the management level, like you just have to keep an eye out and you have to leap on it like as a deadly serious problem, like when you see it.
Yeah, I think it is a huge deal. Just a show of hands, who in this call has had some kind of serious burnout situation before, personally? Yeah. So yeah, it's crazy how normal it is and how normal it really, really shouldn't be. I think so. My first introduction to agile practices was like I was in a work situation where the work was arriving in a very horrible way, and then I was like, this agile thing, let's do this. I implemented it as a self-defense mechanism, and that helped quite a lot to be like, okay, you can't just freaking derail us every time you get a bright idea. We have these sprints now, and yeah, like it's a deep conversation worth having. So for me personally, I so there's this thing called learned helplessness, which exists out there in nature, and you can get rats to have a sense of learned helplessness if you put them in a cage and you um, kind of electrify the floor so that they get hurt and they can't do anything about it. And then if you take some rats and then you like get them to learn like, oh, you can't do anything about this. And then you get some rats that haven't gone through that situation, and now you put the helpless rats and the normal rats into a cage with a little platform that they can jump onto, and you electrify the floor. They can all see this platform, and the non-helpless rats will jump like onto the platform and escape the shocks, and the helpless rats will just be like, well, this is my life. I think that burnout is kind of similar in a lot of ways. It's just like life keeps hitting you with stuff and you don't have any control over it and you don't have any rewards. So I think there's a couple of things to do there. The one is to make things more predictable. I think that helps in a big way. Like if you just like go into work and you have no idea what's going to hit you, and that keeps happening every day, then it's like that's just not good for a person. And then the other thing is you want some kind of reward or celebration. Even if it's a small thing, you can be like, whoa, like we only like wrote this many lines of code, but we fixed this major bug, or so like celebrate whatever you can celebrate along the way, and that's a big help as well. Yeah, it's a hell of a rabbit hole or rat hole to go down.
I can link my my own burnout story with this question of sales targets. So we all say like the sales targets are like unarguable and hitting your sales target means a win. But the problem is that the easiest sale to make is to sell something for less than it's worth. And for dev teams, this means selling people's time at kind of less than it's worth. And then the sale has been made, and the only way that it can kind of, the crunch comes then on the dev team and have to do this impossible thing. So sales targets are also dangerous.
Yeah. There's always that friction between sales and implementation, like everywhere. It's possibly a useful friction a lot of the time if it's like, because you kind of keep each other real to some extent if it's a healthy friction, but it can get very unhealthy as well. I see a couple more questions in the chat. There's one from Lindor. She asks, is it possible to factor in non-development work such as meetings and support when calculating a team's velocity, or is it implied through the team's results? So I think like I once had this dev job where it felt like we were talking about work more than we were working, and that was a real problem. So you do need to communicate and you do need to be in meetings and whatnot, but sometimes those things, sometimes they can be inefficient. I think the stereotypical dev will be like, oh, meetings are a waste of time, but they're not entirely. They are necessary, but they're worth optimizing. Does anybody else want to add?
I wouldn't try to include such things in velocity, because velocity is not kind of what the metric is meant to measure. I think that the kind of meeting that you have is really important. There are definitely meetings which are a complete waste of time, but there are other things which are often not recognized at meetings, like when you go over to the person's desk and the two of you sit down and in like an hour, like thrash out the plan for the next like 3 months of development. Those are super worthwhile. So get rid of the unproductive meetings and have the real conversations that are important. And then I think my other advice around meetings and people are going to consider me crazy, is the most amount of time that should be blocked out in your calendar is 50% as an utter maximum limit. And the reason for this is that there are conversations that you don't know that you need to have, which you need to leave time for.
That makes sense.
If someone manages to convince management to do this with their calendars, let me know.
So do you mean reserve 50% of the time for dev work, or do you mean reserve 50% for meetings?
Well, I leave 50% open. I think that's the important thing, that you could speak to someone or do something completely random. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And Dennis?
Optimizing for flow.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Then there's another question here from Lucky. Hey, Lucky. How do you get your team to be honest in these reflective sessions or health checks?
Yeah.
Cool.
VT?
Yeah. Look, I think so. I'm a big fan of one-on-one meetings. I don't know how everyone feels about that, but I'm like huge fan. I think it creates an opportunity for people to be honest. There's a phenomenon we have now, or like a practice we have at Demon that I've never experienced anywhere before, and it's this concept of people managers. So you might have a line manager for whatever team that you're in, but you have like a buddy who is like your people manager, and they're almost responsible for your growth, because they will be the constant in your time at Demon. So even if you change projects and you have a different line manager, excuse me, you'd have the same people manager. And in those one-on-one sessions, I think that's where I'll sit with my direct reports and I'll say, what are you aiming to accomplish in the next 2 months? Where do you need support? How are things tracking? And then hold people to that. I think those one-on-ones provide a safe space for people to have honest conversations, because it also means that as a people manager, I can ask for feedback on you, right? Like, so my people manager gave me feedback this week that they're not allowed to tell me who gave him the feedback, but they're allowed to share the feedback with me. And I noticed it was like something so simple, really. It was like, VT is great and is a great team leader. And is a team player, but we noticed that he doesn't publicly praise people often enough, right? And I'm like, actually, that's fair, because I work with so many great people, but sometimes just taking 5 minutes to say, listen, Sheena, you've been great to work with. I appreciate your communication and things like that. And I think that practice of having that consistent people manager who can have very frank, direct conversations with you allows you to kind of get into like this rhythm of being very honest and being able to receive feedback. And that creates that kind of safety net where people can be honest about how they feel about their team, because they believe and they understand that the environment has been created for them and it's safe. So that, kind of tying back to psychological safety. And I think one-on-one is a great way to encourage psychological safety, because people don't feel like they're exposed to the rest of the team, and if they say something, then they might be lynched after the meeting.
I'm going to say that this is just a hard problem. I mean, I had a retro where the Scrum Master for my team and I sat in silence for the first 10 minutes of the retro, waiting for kind of the team to kind of really give sort of an honest reflection. And first there was silence, and then they made silly jokes. And only after really sitting in silence for 10 minutes, which was probably one of the most awkward 10 minutes of my life, did someone say something that was kind of genuine. I mean, humans don't like saying negative things on the whole. And maybe the more true they are, the harder it is for people to say them.
Yeah. I think there's also something around, just thinking about the whole color situation with, red, green, and yellow. if people see each other's colors, if they're displayed publicly, like, then of course people would get anchored on each other's things. So I think you do probably need to keep things like hidden away and then show your cards. Yeah, so that's one thing. But yeah, I also fully agree with Simon. Like, getting people to talk is tricky. Something that I do a lot. So we work completely remotely. We use Mural a lot for like retros and things like that. So our staff members will just like add little sticky notes about their thoughts about different things, and I'll like encourage them to say the bad stuff as much as possible. And I think the fact that there aren't names on the sticky notes helps a lot in keeping it like semi-anonymous. Like, you can still find out and you can like follow people around and see what they're doing. But if you get people to make their sticky notes and then like bring them together, then it's semi-private.
Yeah.
And yeah.
You can also you can also try non-verbal things. So something I found has worked very well is you get people to draw a picture of how the sprint went, or to build a Lego thing of how the sprint went. And people think it's super silly, but it brings out things that people, it sort of, as Sheena said, it like pre-commits people a bit so that they have a bit of backing to verbalize it later.
That makes sense. And it brings a playfulness, which takes the edge off.
So what we've done, I think intellect. We build systems. So we built this help check system internally. It's systemized to help facilitate exactly this, to help teams. So the team can use it different ways. So it's, those of you know Signal R, right? So the facilitator will run the session. Everyone's screen will update with the question, and they click red, amber, green. They can only see what they voted. They cannot see what someone else voted. And you go on to the next session, because the first step there is you have no influence on the other ones. I think what I love about Lucky's question is there's so much, it's not a very simple answer, because there's so much EQ involved in dealing with these things, because it's not just a question about health check, it's actually a question about trust. That's the key thing that's in there. And I've had different experiences. So initial team where there was, let's call it bad things that happened, and the big job was creating the psychological safety and stability for the team. For that team, initially, I did not show people's individual results. And how the system would work is you would capture the results and then take out names. And you just see 4 people scored amber, whatever. Over time, by doing this consistently, ask the question, are you guys happy to discuss? Or you know what happened naturally after the second one? People said, yeah, I think that red was me. So what happened there is and suddenly this becomes a thing. Now it's a ritual in your team, and it's a culture thing, and you've done this before and nothing happened. No one got, head got cut off or whatever, and you build the trust. Unfortunately, that's it, right? Trust is time and effort. So you put that stuff in there and you help, and then you go, and you'll see it's awesome when I run a health check for a team for the first time to see their decision, because that small decision on, do you guys want to make this public or not, or do you want to discuss it, immediately tells you where their maturity as a team lie. Because there is a maturity level for each team, and your job is to grow the maturity. And it's very okay if you're not there, you're not uncomfortable yet. So it's a great question, ways to do it.
Yes.
Like you can hide these things. Back in the day, you talk about cards, Shane, back in the day, we didn't have a system. I went to each person and I had and I wrote down red and whatever in silence and secrecy, and then the meeting became 1 hour of me writing down everyone's red, amber, green, and only 1 hour of discussion, which is why we systemize it. But I think just be smart about that, because the value is not actually in the score. The value is in the discussion that people have with each other and the alignment you get from that. So great question. I'm missing you, by the way.
Yeah. On that note, we are just over time, and I think this has been a great discussion. I've got all these notes for like future discussions, new rabbit holes to fall down. Fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody, for taking part. And thank you, audience members, for all your questions and comments. It was really great getting your interactions. Yeah, have a good evening, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.